Hi, I'm James Naylor Green, Professor of Brazilian History and Culture Emeritus at Brown University and the National Co-Coordinator of the U.S. Network for Democracy in Brazil. This program is supported by the Washington, Brazil office. This is Brazil Unfiltered. Today we have the pleasure of receiving Rubens Glezer, who is a professor of constitutional law at the Getúlio Vargas Foundation Law School in São Paulo. He holds a PhD in legal theory from the University of São Paulo, a master's in law and development from the Getúlio Vargas Law School, and is a visiting research fellow at New York University. Glezer is a specialist in the Brazilian Supreme Court and is the author of many articles and other works, a frequent commentator in the media about the country's highest court, and the author of the book Resiliência e Deslealdade Constitucional, Resilience and Constitutional Disloyalty, nominated for the prestigious book award Jabuti Prize in 2024. Rubens, thank you so much for joining us today on Brazil Unfiltered.
Thank you, James. It's a pleasure to be here.
Great. So today we're going to look at the current situation in Brazil regarding the legal cases against former President Jair Bolsonaro and others accused of trying to carry out a coup after the 2022 presidential elections. Rubens, could you start explaining to our listener about the situation with Bolsonaro in the Brazilian Supreme Court and what are the charges against him? What's the conditions around that? Why did the government bring charges against him?
Sure. So the charges are basically that while Bolsonaro was in office, he planned and took measures to try to stage a coup d'etat in case he did not win the 2022 elections. So these actions included discussing executive order to concentrate executive powers and restrain liberties so he couldn't be in office for an indeterminate period of time. He took meetings with the leaders of the armed forces and tried to persuade them to be with him in this attempt. These meetings occurred and have proof. The executive decree was discussed, printed, edited, and also President Bolsonaro was aware of a plan that almost took place to assassinate one of the Supreme Court justices, Ministro Alexandre de Moraes, and to poison the actual president Lula and his vice president Geraldo Alckmin. So these are serious accusations, and there's a lot of proof. There's a lot of written records, WhatsApp messages, so on and so forth. So it's very unusual to think that we have this many documented proof of such actions, but I believe that Bolsonaro and his crew had blind faith that they would succeed and would not be charged.
So, following up on that, I think it's interesting to see that the invasion of the Brazilian central area of the capital, which has the Congress, the Supreme Court headquarters, and the administrative building of the president's office. People invaded those three buildings and destroyed the property as part of the reaction to the coup. Now, Bolsonaro was in the United States at the time, so he claimed that he was innocent and far away from the events. How does that play into this the accusations against him that Bolsonaro was in the United States when much of the violence took place?
So this is the more fragile part of the accusation, not so much because he was in the United States, because it's perfectly plausible that he could direct and coordinate the coup with his agents from abroad with internet and cell phones, etc. But the public prosecutor's office has to show how this acts of the end of 2022, while he was in office, is clearly connected with these manifestations of people throughout the end of 2022, the beginning of 2023, in front of the army, asking for interventions, military interventions, asking for the coup d'etat that culminated in the January 8th, that it's our capital invasion, right? So, but it's not easy to make this link, because this could be treated as two separate issues. But for now, the Supreme Court is understanding to treat both as Bolsonaro guilty or can be trialed by both. Then we have just cause to trial him for both hypotheses.
And so for our listeners who might not follow the details of what happened in Brazil after the elections were in October of 22. Lula won by a 2-point advantage at the end of the day. And immediately after that, Bolsonaro supporters started mobilizing, blocking traffic all over the country. And then when that really backfired and people found that really annoying, and many people couldn't get to hospitals, there were many problems, then they went, as you mentioned, and camped outside of military installations, headquarters locally off the country, demanding the military intervene. And this led, this continuation of this escalation in Brasilia in January led to people marching on the Plaza of Three Powers, which is the name of the area where the three buildings are, and to try to carry out the coup. So I think many people just assume that Bolsonaro is going to be convicted. What is your assessment of that? Do you think he will be convicted, as far as you can tell, or what's your feeling about that?
Okay, so everything points toward his being found guilty, because we, as I said, we have a lot of proof. The line of defense is very evasive, because what is established in the criminal code is that the crime is the attempt to abolish the rule of law, the democratic rule of law. So what the lawyers are saying, well, he's not trying per se, but he was considering to abolish the rule of law. And I don't think that this is very persuasive to this set of Supreme Court justices. They are very inclined to see how Bolsonaro tried to abolish the rule of law, how he attacked the electoral system, that it's maintained by justice, very different from the United States. The electoral system is maintained in the US by the political system, right? In Brazil is run by the judicial system, that it's subordinate to the Supreme Court. So they lived this attack against the Supreme Court, against the judicial branch that runs the elections, and they lived in real time with threats against them, against the institution. So they have a real sense of how close we came to a real coup d'etat, that it's very far away of merely considering, etc., etc. And in some sense, a lot of the political world, even the right, will consider that Bolsonaro went beyond what is considered to be legitimate and fair game in politics. So he's already inelectable, right? And when he became inelectable,
you're explaining he's ineligible to run for office.
Sorry, ineligible. He's already is.
So that was based on what? And who made that decision that he couldn't run for office until 2030? Who made that decision?
Okay, it was the electoral justice, because he made a meeting with a lot of foreign ambassadors trying to imply or affirm that the system was fraudulent with no base. And so this was understood as an electoral crime. So he's ineligible for that already. So this sets forth a space where, when that happened, there was no great manifestations of the right wing. There was no street movements. There was no rallies. This was treated as acceptable even by the far right, because he's someone that the political system doesn't want to deal with. That seems they want the benefit of having the Bolsonaro idea, of having Bolsonarist voters, but Bolsonaro in itself is more a problem than a solution, even for the right.
So, in the United States, when Trump was accused of being involved in electoral fraud and interference and trying to overturn the election results, which led to the invasion of the Capitol, that the cases that went against him were local. They were tried in different district courts. They didn't go right to the Supreme Court. Why in Brazil do the charges against Bolsonaro and former generals and other members of his government. Why does it go immediately to the Supreme Court? What's the legal reasons for that?
Okay, so we have here our Supreme Court has a lot of we call competencies. It has a lot of hats. So it's a constitutional court because it examines judicial review cases where it considers the constitutionality of laws. It is a Supreme Court because it is the last instance of revision of ordinary cases. You can go, and a lot of cases go to the Supreme Court. And it also trials these criminal cases directly. It's called foro privilegiado. It's a kind of a guarantee for someone that holds office. It won't suffer lawsuits against throughout the country, right? So they will be investigated and prosecuted only in one place in name of political stability. So these rules of foro privilegiado put figures as the president, senators, federal congressmen directly in the Supreme Court or the Superior Court of Electoral Justice.
So you implied that many people think that Bolsonaro will be convicted. But what is the defense that his attorneys are going to use, in addition to the fact that the links between causality between what he wanted to have happen and what happened were not very close or direct? What is the defense making as an argument to say why he should not be found guilty?
Okay, so the basic arguments will be there's no proof, right, of causation. That is very difficult to prove in any case like that. There was a direct order or something like that to execute the coup d'etat, right? They always have some message from some subordinates saying that Bolsonaro told him to do that, this and that. So you have these arguments about proof. And the second arguments, as I said earlier, are regards the idea that he was not really attempting to make a coup d'etat, but he was just considering to take this line of action, that he talked, that he had meetings, but he did not seriously pursue this. That, of course, is not a really plausible line of argumentation. It does not seem to be very effective to this pack of justices. But all can change if the Congress approves the amnesty law. And then the argument will be just the opposite.
Well, I'm going to get to that in a minute, but let's look at this a little bit more in terms of the accusations. When I read in the newspapers in Brazil that Bolsonaro and many of the generals were in his government were being indicted by the federal police, I was really in shock, because this is the first time as an historian of Brazil to see this happening, the implications, the unprecedentedness of this action. Could you give a context to our listener about what it means for the military to be possibly condemned to years in prison in Brazil, and why that's such an unusual thing?
Sure. In Brazil, we have a tradition to deal with this kind of conflicts with no accountability, right? The parties try normally, especially the elites, try to get along and put it in the past, with institutional mechanisms or without, right? So the idea, and that happened also with the dictatorship, the military dictatorship that was installed in Brazil from 1964 to 1987, 1988, where we solved the problem of the we could install democracy by a law of general and broad amnesty, where no one would be investigated or persecuted in reasons of political crimes. So not the democratic subverters of the regime, nor the torturers of the regime, right? Nor who was from the regime or against the regime would be prosecuted. So this was a very strong mark.
Just to be clear about that, that means that no one, including the people who tortured former President Dilma Rousseff, have ever been prosecuted in a criminal case or found, therefore no one has been found guilty because there have been no cases. In a few civil cases, people have been found guilty of violation of human rights, but not in any criminal case. So this is the first time actually there would be some kind of responsibility for people who are going against the democratic order, because nothing like that happened after the 21 to 25 years of the dictatorship, however you count the end of it. So that's pretty significant to me. Will they get away with that? Will the military, will the armed forces allow some of their members to be put to jail for 5, 10, 15, 20 years?
Well, James, that is unprecedented. But we're having this prospect, and we are having this prospect because of this one peculiar justice called Alexandre de Moraes, that it is completely outside or doesn't care for this tradition of putting things aside. He was by formation a public prosecutor. For many years, he was a public prosecutor in the state of São Paulo, which is a very prestigious career. It is very prestigious. He was a secretary of security here and justice. He was a ministry of justice. He has a long public career on law enforcement and a law and order punitivist type. So when he comes to the Supreme Court, appointed by Temer, who is a right-wing leader, a right-wing president, and Alexandre de Moraes is a right-wing man, a conservative, but he is a punitivist. So as soon as he gets in touch with these crimes against the Supreme Court, the justices, rule of law, he has no interest in negotiate. He has no interest to pardon or to forget. He wants to put all of them in jail. So it is a very weird moment when you have this very high place of judicial hierarchy, someone that is not bound by the informal rules of elites of not getting so rough on each other, that it's very unprecedented between us.
Oh, but some people criticize Alexandre de Moraes with the argument that he has a subjective stake in the matter. He should recuse himself because he has actually himself been the object of violent accusations by some of the people who he's charging, who have denounced him. And so he's not recused himself. He said, "No, I'm gonna stand in this determination in this trial. I'm gonna be a part of it." Other justices who were appointed by Lula, including the person who defended him against the car wash operations, is also going to be ruling over this case. In the United States, that would be something that traditionally would be considered inappropriate, although in recent years with Trump, anything goes. But how does that seen in Brazil by lawyers and legal advisors about this question of one's involvement in a case and being a judge in a case in which one has been accused by the defendants of committing crimes effectively?
It's very ambiguous because on one hand, the practice of Brazil is not so strict on partiality and bias as it was in America judicial practice, right? So we have a large history on the Supreme Court and the other judges also not being so, they think that if they feel they are impartial, they can rule on the case, right? So they have all these anecdotal cases where they ruled in spite of popular commotion finding that reasonably arbitrary. So this is the practice, right? It's a deteriorated practice. It does not have a deference to this sense of they should make all they can, all the efforts, all the best efforts to seem impartial, right?
So
But also this is a defective practice.
it's interesting too, because Alexandre de Moraes is also being attacked by Elon Musk because of the question of his ordering things that were on Twitter, which is now X, that were being that the government, Brazilian government, wanted to remove because they thought that they were anti-democratic, promoting possibility of a coup or anti-democratic sentiments. So I'm anticipating, as the trial becomes more visible in the United States, at least X, former Twitter, and Elon Musk are going to increase their attacks on both on Alexandre de Moraes and on the whole process, I'm assuming, because they're going to argue that he's not neutral, he's not impartial. But a lot of that has to do with Elon Musk being very angry at Alexandre de Moraes as well. Do you think that's going to play into this dynamic of the elections, this feud between Alexandre de Moraes and the United States, or Elon Musk around free speech and free expression on the internet?
I think that the case against the excesses of the Justice Alexandre de Moraes and the Supreme Court in general will play a part in the 2026 election. It is already an electoral platform that it's easily available to any kind of political office today. To be a right-wing candidate, it will be very easy and charming to use an anti-Supreme Court speech, saying, well, we have the Supreme Court is punishing the right, they are not protecting the free speech, etc., etc., etc. So this is already happening. It will be widely used in the next year elections, and it's a problem for a Supreme Court that is losing all kind of authority over the years for a decade now, from right and from the left also. The confidence index in the Supreme Court are very low, but they keep stressing their power more and more, and this will end badly. We have the possibility that justice will be impeached in the next years, which will be also unprecedented.
So when Donald Trump was inaugurated on the 20th of January, one of the first measures he took was to give an amnesty to all of the people involved in the January 6th invasion of the U.S. Capitol, which was expected. He promised that, but was very shocking because these people were involved in crimes. They had been convicted through trial by jury, having to produce evidence. Some people were not acquitted, others were sent to small sentences, others for many years in jail. And it seems very clear that that's going to be the intention. In fact, that is the intention of this movement in Congress now, to get enough signatures to pass so that you can force a vote on a law that would amnesty Bolsonaro and all the people involved in the January 8th, 2023 invasion of the Praça dos Três Poderes. So how are you seeing this movement, the initiative in the Congress to try to pass a bill? Do you think the bill will pass? And if it does, what does this bring a shock between the Supreme Court and the Congress?
Yeah, so this is complicated. It's a lot of asymmetry of information because the majority of Brazilians do not want amnesty. We have polls that sign that, but the right-wing parties are blocking all congressional activities to discuss this amnesty law that is very broad. So it's not just for people that stormed the capital, the Brazilian capital, but also for anyone that has a direct or indirect activity with them. So it would also be a law to amnesty Bolsonaro, and so he could become eligible again and could not be found guilty to extinct the actual process that is going on, right? So what could happen? The Congress could approve this law, this bill of amnesty, and the Constitutional Court, the Brazilian Constitutional Court, to make an analysis of its constitutionality and consider that it's only valid for this massive maneuver, the people that stormed the Capitol with and that committed minor felonies or whatever, and consider unconstitutional to amnesty the leaders. That would be a very Brazilian way out of this situation, and very possible.
So if we look at this and we see a trial, we see a conviction, we see an attempt to guarantee that some of the military and Bolsonaro are in jail, and if there's not a coup d'etat, which is a big question in my mind, what is going to be the long-term impact of that, do you think, on Brazilian society? Well, the short term in terms of the 2026 elections, which are for the president, governors, and legislators. But what do you think could be, other than municipal legislation and mayors of cities, that's happened in another time. What do you think of the impact in short term and long term if, in fact, Bolsonaro is convicted?
So I think the right is going to suffer a fracture, right? Because the right to face the left in Brazil has to, until now, agglomerate and accommodate all these conflictive interests and a lot of different intuitions about what is to be a right-wing party, etc., etc. And we have this more institutional, democratic right, conservatives, and we have this crazy, radical, anti-system, reactionary, terrorist, spiritual types that do not have any kind of dialogue with these other types and are out of the institutional democratic game. They don't know how to operate and are very aggressive towards the institutional setup of separation of powers, federalism, etc., etc. Right? So I think with Bolsonaro out of power, you don't have this kind of leadership that glues all of them together, and the right will have to decide. We'll have to see what Brazilians will go. The Brazilian right will go to this institutional, democratic, conservative right, or this reactionary, monarchy inclined, spiritual leader, coaches, etc., etc. That it's also on the table. So I think there will be a decisive moment for the right, and this will see if we can have a country with elections, institutional disputes, or if we are going to a scenery more chaotic, more divisive, and possibly of secession. Maybe what we can have in the near future, it's the end of this great democratic political communities, right? We had a pact, a Leninist pact, that we could live together peacefully and try to solve our divergences, our disagreements through institutional means. And this pact is under severe threat, and it could end. And if it ends, what we can see is divided countries, secession, or maybe civil wars.
Let me take advantage of one last kind of set of questions having to do with the amazingly wonderful movie Ainda Estou Aqui, I'm Still Here. And if our listeners haven't seen it yet, please do that. It's an amazing movie about the disappearance of Rubens Paiva and the way his wife, Eunice Paiva, and the family kind of dealt with a disappearance in 1970, 1971. when the relatives of the victims of disappeared peoples and people who were killed by the military mobilized against the amnesty law that allowed for there to be an amnesty for people who had been involved in gross violations of human rights. Many people argued that it was time to turn the page. Virar página. Let's just move on. We can't think about the past. We need to look for the future. Um, is that argument an argument you do anticipate will be used again in terms of what we need to do here? In other words, okay, well, let's convict Bolsonaro, but let's turn the page by not putting him in jail because that would be unseemly to have a president in jail, though ironically, Lula spent over a year in jail. So the right has no problem with putting presidents in jail. So I guess maybe the left should have no problem with that. But how do you say that playing out in this regard?
I think this option is on the table. I think it's a very strong argument. I think we have a very strong tradition of turning the page, right? But this had some nefarious effects on our political system. Our security force is brutal against the poor. We have a huge problem of inequality, not only socioeconomical, but under the law. Because of that, because we have too much people above the law with impunity, and we have too much people under the law that doesn't have the minimal protection, the minimum of guarantees. So the idea that even military, even powerful politicians, even entrepreneurs are accountable will be a radical shift in our culture.
So just one last question. It's related to the 2026 elections. People are already talking about who the candidates will be. Will Lula run again? He has the right to do that, or will there be another candidate? Lula's popularity is down, but when you poll him against another candidate, he seems to be the most viable presidential candidate at this point, more than 2 years before the election. But one of the biggest frontrunners is Tarcísio, the governor of São Paulo. And I'm forgetting his last name right now. Tarcísio. Do you remember? Everyone forgets it. It's just
Yes, that's amazing. I just completely
unimportant
forgot.
last name, just Tarcísio.
All right.
He's supporting Bolsonaro. He was going to the rallies with Bolsonaro. On the other hand, in order to be elected, he needs to get the far right and what was traditionally the center right or the conservative right, uh, reflected largely in the party of the Brazilian Social Democracy, PSDB, which is splintered and much of it has gone to the far right. So how does he how does he pull this off? Because on one hand, if he supports Bolsonaro, he loses all possibility of support from kind of conservative traditionalists, shall I say. And if he condemns Bolsonaro or supports the final decision, if there is a decision against him, he will lose the support of the far right because his Bolsonaro supporters will go against him. So how does he thread that needle, as they say? How does he manage that complexity?
He poses, Tarcísio de Freitas poses as a technocrat, right? He worked during the Dilma government in one of the ministries, so he poses as someone that it's an outsider from politics, and he's tough on laws, but not so tough. He's not eccentric. He can dialogue, but he's been brutal on the state of São Paulo and had accomplished very little. The public security in the state is it's in chaos, but his PR is we're doing privatizations, and this kind of discourse, a technocratic discourse, is very sympathetic to Brazilian conservative voters. So after Lula, Bolsonaro and Lula, it's very likely to elect some kind of technocrats. They'll say, well, let's get politics on the side and solve the economic crisis or whatever. I think this has huge electoral advantage in Brazil.
Interesting. Well, I want to thank you so much for an amazingly interesting conversation today. We really learned a lot about this process going on, and it's something we're going to be paying a lot of attention to as it unfolds this year. Thank you so much for joining us today, Rubens.
Thank you. It was a great honor. I'm eager to be here again as soon as possible.
Great. So I hope you enjoyed the interview. If you're watching on YouTube, don't forget to like the video. And if you have not yet subscribed, please do so. And if you're listening on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your podcast, please leave us a 5-star review. It helps some people find the program. Have a great week. Until next time, até a próxima.